The thick blanket of night hung over the city like a darkened shroud, every corner obscured by the shadows of uncertainty. The low hum of the German bombers above was the only sound that broke the silence, their presence like a specter, unseen, yet undeniably felt. In the dim light that barely escaped from the flickering street lamps, the city was a fractured version of itself, buildings with broken windows, walls that had been shattered by prior blasts, and streets that had once been vibrant now lying in ruins. Even the air, heavy with the scent of smoke and dust, seemed to carry a weight that hung over the city. The constant threat of air raids had turned the once bustling metropolis into a hollowed-out shell, its spirit chipped away bit by bit with every passing day. Inside homes and shelters, the civilians lived in a permanent state of suspended fear. There was no safety, no reprieve, just the crushing anticipation of when the next wave would come. Some families had long given up on trying to sleep through the nights, choosing instead to sit huddled in silence, waiting for the bombings to begin. Others took refuge in makeshift bunkers in the basements of their homes or in the labyrinthine alleyways that wound through the city. These makeshift hideaways, however, offered little more than a false sense of protection. They were temporary fortresses against an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time. With every passing night, the city's once vibrant character began to erode, as the psychological toll of the constant bombings became unbearable. Children, once filled with laughter and life, now stared blankly ahead, their eyes reflecting the fear and confusion they couldn't fully understand. Parents, too, were caught in an unspoken cycle of anxiety. How long could they shield their children from the terror outside? How long could they convince themselves that the bombs wouldn't fall on their homes, that somehow this night might be the exception? The sirens would often blare out of nowhere, causing everyone to freeze in place, a collective intake of breath before they scrambled to their shelters. Some had begun to question whether these sirens were meant as a warning or simply as a cruel reminder that there was no escaping the nightmare. The first bomb would fall with a deafening crash, a violent shudder that reverberated through the air and shook the ground beneath their feet. Then, just as the world seemed to go still, the second would follow, then the third. The rhythm of destruction had become so predictable that many had stopped reacting altogether. The fear, though ever-present, had turned into something almost mechanical, a learned response to an inevitable event. But even so, each new bomb felt like a betrayal, an irrevocable break in the fragile illusion of normalcy they had clung to. The heavy silence that followed each explosion was worse than the blasts themselves. It was a reminder that no matter how many times the bombers left, they would always return. In the moments after the explosions, the city would be swallowed by a stillness that felt foreign, oppressive even. The kind of stillness that made people question their own safety. People would venture cautiously out from their hiding places, peeking out of windows or doorways to survey the damage. The once crowded streets had now become a labyrinth of debris. The pavement was cracked, the buildings mutilated, their once majestic facades now reduced to jagged, exposed bones. There was no sense of hope, only a pervasive, suffocating sense of helplessness. No matter how much they wished for some sign of salvation, none seemed to come. The hours between raids were filled with uncertainty. Was it safe to go out? Could they continue their lives in this warped version of existence? Some tried to carry on as though life could still be lived normally. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to hold onto any semblance of normalcy. Markets that once bustled with life were now deserted. The shops that were still open sold only the bare essentials, with shelves stocked haphazardly, their goods sparse and expensive. Even the usual sounds of city life, chatter in the streets, the clatter of trains, the hum of distant traffic, had given way to an eerie silence that never quite left. It was as though the very pulse of the city had been stilled, leaving only a faint echo of what had once been. Those who could fled. But where could they go? And what would they return to if they did leave? Many knew, deep down, that it was not just their homes that were being torn apart, but the very fabric of their lives. The community that had once thrived in the heart of the city now felt distant. People kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact, as if to acknowledge one another was to bring forth some unwelcome reminder of the devastation they were all living through. Conversations had become sparse, if not completely absent. What could anyone say in a world where words seemed inadequate? Some exchanged glances, others barely acknowledged one another, trapped in a web of shared fear. In the depths of their isolation, there was an undeniable sense that they had been abandoned, not just by their own government, which was embroiled in its own war efforts, but by the very world that had promised them protection. The British, their distant allies, had pledged to defend them, to safeguard the civilians caught in the crossfire of a war they had not chosen. But in reality, the promise seemed hollow. Their military might was focused elsewhere, on far more strategic objectives, leaving the city's population to fend for itself. The distant hum of British bombers, soaring high above the city's skyline, became a bitter reminder of what was not being done. While the British fought their own battles on foreign soil, the people below were left to face their own. They had hoped, in the beginning, that the British would arrive as liberators, bringing light and safety to their fractured world. But the bombings from both sides had only served to blur the lines between friend and foe. Could anyone truly save them, or were they just pawns in a war that had nothing to do with them? Night after night, the bombardments continued. The city, once a thriving hub of life, now felt like a ghost town, its people fading into the shadows. Everyone lived in a state of perpetual mourning, not for those who had already fallen, but for the lives that had yet to be lost. The uncertainty of what would come next was far more haunting than any explosion. As each bomb fell, it was a reminder that no one was safe. There was no guarantee of survival. Each day brought a new wave of destruction, a new round of losses. And yet, amidst the hopelessness, there was a flicker, a fragile, quiet flicker, that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But how? In the darkest hours of that endless night, a single thought clung to the minds of the civilians like a faint thread of hope. They were not forgotten. And yet, as each night passed without intervention, that thread thinned. No matter how hard they tried to hold on to it, they were starting to wonder if it was slipping away for good. The days blurred together in a disorienting cycle of dread and survival. As the bombings rained down night after night, a crushing weight seemed to settle over the city, a suffocating blanket that would not lift. Each day began the same, with the promise of something more, but quickly devolved into the rhythm of loss. The civilians, weary from the relentless terror, could no longer distinguish between the end of one raid and the beginning of the next. Time itself had become an enemy, as fleeting moments of peace gave way to a return of the same. The survivors lived in a suspended reality, one where their lives were continuously threatened, and where their bodies, minds, and souls seemed to bend under the unbearable strain. As the sun sank below the horizon each evening, a sense of collective tension would settle over the city. There was no peace to be found in the night, no sanctuary in the stars. People knew that the moment the sky darkened, they would be vulnerable to another attack. The sounds of the city, once so familiar, had disappeared. The chatter of children, the clamor of street vendors, the bustle of traffic, everything was muted now, replaced by the haunting silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The city's heartbeat had slowed, and the few remaining sounds were those of hollow footsteps in alleys or the occasional door creaking open as another family took their place in the shelters. There was no telling who might emerge from the rubble the next day, or if anyone would emerge at all. The shelters themselves were no refuge from the madness outside. No matter how deep or secure the shelter appeared to be, it was impossible to escape the crushing fear that clung to the people within. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and the faint tang of fear that permeated every breath. Families huddled together in tight, uncomfortable spaces, their conversations reduced to whispers. Children tried to sleep, but their dreams were interrupted by the nightmarish reality of the world they were trapped in. Parents, too, struggled to find any semblance of rest. Each time they closed their eyes, the images of what they had lost, and what they could still lose, flooded their minds. Some tried to comfort their children with hollow words of reassurance, but those words rang empty, a futile attempt to instill hope where none seemed to exist. The nights stretched endlessly, and with each passing hour, the anxiety within the people of the city grew more suffocating. The sirens were the only warning of the impending doom. They would wail through the streets, a shrill, insistent sound that tore through the stillness, sending a wave of panic through the residents. The siren's cry, once a simple sound signaling a distant threat, had now become a signal for them to prepare for the worst. It was not a question of if the bombs would fall, but when. The civilians had learned to brace themselves not for the blast, but for the silence that came afterward. The moments of stillness between the raids felt like an eternity. Every time the bombers disappeared over the horizon, the people would emerge cautiously, surveying the damage, only to retreat once more to the safety of their underground sanctuaries. Though the bombing raids were no longer a surprise, each new strike felt like the first. The impact was always jarring, sending shockwaves through the ground that rattled bones and shattered windows. The violence of it all seemed so unnatural, as though the world itself had gone mad. Buildings, once sturdy and proud, crumbled under the force of the explosions. The sky above, which had once held the promise of beauty, was now marred by the dark plumes of smoke that rose from the destruction below. What had been a city full of life, culture, and history was now little more than a decaying carcass, a victim of the war that had swallowed it whole. Yet in the midst of all this devastation, the people of the city endured. They had no choice but to endure. Even as the bombs fell and the world around them disintegrated, the civilians held onto something more fragile than survival itself. They clung to the possibility of a future that might one day come, even if that future seemed impossibly far away. They knew deep down that their survival was not guaranteed. Each day was a battle not just against the physical forces that sought to destroy them, but against the crushing weight of hopelessness that threatened to overtake their spirits. It was easier to give in to despair, to let the darkness take over, but there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where they could almost taste the sweetness of life as it once was. Those memories of laughter in the streets and sunlight glinting off cobblestone roads kept them tethered to something real, something worth fighting for. But even those memories could not stop the feeling of isolation that gripped them. They were no longer just residents of a war-torn city. They had become the forgotten. The British, their supposed allies, seemed far away, absorbed in their own campaign. The promises of protection, of aid, felt more like distant echoes than tangible offers of salvation. The military might of the British, which had been expected to act as a shield for the civilians, was a distant, abstract thing. Their aircraft flew overhead, but they did not descend to offer aid or protection. The war was a game of strategy, of moving pieces on a chessboard. The civilians, it seemed, were not considered part of that game. They were collateral damage, victims of a war that had far more significant stakes than the lives of ordinary people. With each new day, the civilians questioned whether the British would ever arrive to help them. The thought was a lingering presence, always there in the back of their minds, like an unanswered prayer. How long could they survive in this environment of constant danger and uncertainty? Would the war ever end? Would they ever feel safe again? The silence between the bombings began to feel even worse than the bombings themselves, as though the people were caught in a holding pattern, waiting for something that might never come. It was not just the lack of help that caused their frustration, but the seeming indifference of those in power. The government seemed focused on larger goals, on winning the war through strategic victories, while the city below was left to burn. The British presence, though undeniably felt through the hum of their bombers, seemed more like an afterthought. Their defenses, though strong, did little to alleviate the suffering on the ground. The city's residents had become pawns, forgotten in the broader scope of a war that was too vast, too complex, for their voices to be heard. The British had promised them safety, but where was it? Where was the security they had been promised? The light they had been promised remained an illusion, flickering dimly in the distance, just out of reach. As the weeks passed, the people's frustrations grew, but so did their resolve. The sense of isolation that had once threatened to break their spirits began to forge something new, a collective resilience. They were no longer just waiting to be rescued. They had no choice but to survive on their own terms, for they knew that no one would come for them unless they fought for it themselves. They had learned that they could not wait for the world to change. If they were going to survive, they would have to make it happen. But how? The answer was uncertain. The city was a maze of destruction, its streets littered with the detritus of war. And yet, amid the rubble, they began to see something new, a quiet solidarity that had not existed before. They were not alone, not forgotten. Somehow, they would endure. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks blurred into months. Life in the city had become a struggle for survival, a long, drawn-out battle between the people and the war that had overtaken every aspect of their existence. The bombings had become so regular that they almost seemed like a new kind of rhythm, as if the city had been reduced to nothing more than a machine, grinding along through endless destruction. For the civilians, this relentless barrage of violence and fear had taken its toll in ways that were impossible to measure. Yet, in the midst of the ever-present chaos, they were forced to continue, to adapt, to survive, despite the overwhelming odds. There was no time for reflection, no space to grieve what had been lost. Every day was simply about keeping the thread of life alive, no matter how frayed or fragile it had become. The streets, once full of the noise of busy life, were now silent except for the occasional footsteps of those who dared to venture out. The stores that remained open no longer sold the simple pleasures that had once made life bearable: fresh bread, vegetables, cloth to patch up old clothes. Instead, they had become barren, their shelves nearly empty, stocked only with what was necessary for survival. Even the most basic goods were now rationed, carefully doled out, as if every item had been reduced to its barest essence, a reminder that every resource was finite. The world had become a place of scarcity, of loss, and people began to view everything they had, not as something to enjoy, but as something to hold on to protect from the next calamity. In the midst of all this, there was a sense that the city had become a ghost of itself, its former identity smothered beneath the weight of war. The once vibrant markets, filled with traders hawking goods and locals exchanging pleasantries, now stood desolate, their empty stalls a grim reflection of the collective loss. The air, once filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and conversation, was now heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional sound of distant explosions. The city no longer felt like home, but more like a place where people simply existed, caught between the dying remnants of the past and an uncertain future. Yet, despite the destruction and despair that had come to define daily life, there was one thing that refused to be extinguished: the resolve of the people. Beneath the surface of exhaustion and sorrow, a quiet determination had begun to take root. It was a determination born not of grand hopes, but of sheer necessity. They no longer expected miracles. They no longer believed that anyone would come to rescue them. The British, who had once been their hope, were now distant figures, their promises lost in the haze of the war. It wasn't that they had abandoned the people of the city, it was simply that their efforts were directed elsewhere, toward objectives far more strategic than the safety of a small, war-torn urban center. The bombers that passed overhead, while a constant reminder of their presence, brought no comfort. The British were not there to save them, they were there to fight a war, and the civilians were left to fend for themselves. In the absence of any real aid, the people began to look inward, relying on one another for support. They formed tight-knit communities within the shelters, sharing what little food and water they had, comforting one another in the long stretches of silence between the bombings. The feeling of isolation, once so overpowering, began to shift into something else: a bond, a collective understanding that they were in this together, and that no one could survive alone. Families that had once kept to themselves, hoarding their belongings and secrets, now opened their doors to others in need. Strangers became allies, and alliances were formed not out of strategy, but out of the basic human instinct to survive. In a world that had been broken apart by bombs and violence, the people of the city began to rebuild something even more fragile than their homes: a sense of community. This sense of solidarity, though born out of necessity, began to change the way the people viewed the world around them. It was no longer just about surviving the next raid, or waiting for the next wave of destruction to pass. It was about holding on to something that felt worth preserving, even if that something was nothing more than the shared experiences of those who lived through the same horrors. They began to reclaim parts of their lives that had been stolen by the war, small acts of defiance, of humanity, that made the destruction feel less absolute. A woman would sew a torn dress for a neighbor, a child would share a toy with another, A group would gather in a basement and tell stories of better times. These were the small victories that made survival bearable. They could not control the bombs that rained down from above, but they could control the ways in which they cared for one another. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the darkness at bay for just a little longer. As the weeks wore on, the British presence remained just as distant as it had been before. Their airstrikes continued, their efforts aimed at disrupting the enemy's supply lines and weakening the enemy's strongholds. But the civilians below, who had once hoped that these strikes would be a sign of impending rescue, now understood the futility of such hopes. The British were not here to save them. They were here to fight a war, and the people in the city were little more than collateral damage in the grand scheme of things. The people had placed their trust in the British, but that trust had been slowly eroded as the days dragged on without any meaningful support. They were not forgotten, per se, but they were not the priority. It was a bitter realization, but it was one that the people of the city had to come to terms with if they were to move forward. This realization did not lead to despair, however. Instead, it fueled a deeper sense of determination. If the British were not coming to save them, then they would save themselves. They would not wait any longer for someone to intervene. They would take control of their own fate, even if that meant doing so in the face of overwhelming odds. This was not an act of rebellion, but an act of survival. The city had been reduced to rubble, its bones exposed to the world, but it was still standing. The people, too, were still standing. They had not been broken. Not yet. This shift in perspective led to a subtle, yet profound change in the way people approached their daily lives. In the beginning, survival had been about simply enduring the bombings, about getting through the night and hoping to see the next day. But now, survival meant something more. It meant finding moments of peace, however small, amidst the chaos. It meant preserving the things that made life worth living, even if those things were fleeting. The people of the city had learned to adapt to a world where nothing was certain, but where human connections still held meaning. They had found a new way of living, not one of hope, but one of resilience. They were no longer waiting for the British to save them, because they had learned to save themselves. But this newfound sense of self-reliance did not come without a price. The people of the city had become hardened, not out of choice, but out of necessity. They had witnessed too much loss, too much suffering, to remain unchanged. The innocence that had once characterized their lives had been replaced by a cold pragmatism, a belief that only what was necessary to survive mattered. There was no room for frivolous pursuits, no space for dreaming of a future that might never come. Their lives had been distilled into the most basic of functions: survival, preservation, and the quiet hope that tomorrow might be just a little less terrible than today. In the absence of any clear resolution, the civilians had found a new way to live in the war. They were not passive victims, but active participants in their own survival. They had learned that they could endure. And in enduring, they had learned that the war had not broken them, not yet. The night stretched on, heavy and oppressive, as it always did, but something was different now. The usual quiet dread that had come to define the city after sunset seemed to tremble at the edges, as though something beyond the inevitable dark was quietly creeping forward. For the first time in what felt like forever, the horizon flickered, a glow appearing on the distant skyline like an unexpected spark. The civilians who had long since abandoned hope of seeing the world outside their shattered city ever light up again could hardly believe their eyes. This light wasn't the cruel illumination of another bombing, nor the dull red-orange hues of destruction. They had seen those too many times to mistake them for anything else. No, this was something else, something brighter, steadier, and undeniably hopeful. The faint glow gradually grew stronger, cutting through the perpetual night like a lighthouse beacon, promising something that the people had long forgotten: safety. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, no one knew what it was. It could have been another bomb, a flare signaling some new, deadly assault. But it wasn't. The soft glow, like the warm flicker of a lamp, became clearer, stretching out across the sky, slowly spilling its light over the edges of the city. As the air thickened with anticipation, the civilians who had gathered to witness this sight couldn't help but wonder, what was this light? Could it be a sign, an omen, or simply the latest illusion to break their hearts again? Then, it became unmistakable. The glow wasn't just a glimmer on the horizon. It was a collection of small, steady lights, dotting the broken streets like tiny, fragile stars. British lamps, lamps that had appeared in the wake of the bombings, the debris, and the destruction, were glowing softly across the ruins of the city. At first, it seemed an odd and minor gesture, mere lights in the midst of a city so ravaged, so irrevocably altered. But as the light spilled further across the jagged landscape, illuminating debris-strewn streets and collapsed homes, it became something more. It became a symbol of something larger than what could be measured by the power of a light bulb. It was a signal of protection. For months, the city had been submerged in darkness, literally and figuratively. The only light had been that of the bombs, violent, sudden, blinding, and even that had never lasted. Now, in the silence that followed the last bombing raid, there was something that no one had dared to expect: the quiet, welcoming glow of a foreign hand reaching across the shattered remains of the city to offer some kind of solace. The British, who had promised so much and yet, until now, had been little more than distant figures in the sky, had finally arrived. But it wasn't with the roar of fighter jets or the thunder of military might. It was something far smaller, far humbler, and in many ways, far more powerful: light, warmth, and safety. The residents, initially hesitant, slowly began to emerge from their shelters, cautiously stepping into the unfamiliar glow. It was a light that held no malice, no ill intention. It wasn't an airstrike, it wasn't a raid. It was an offering, a quiet promise. The British, it seemed, had not abandoned them. The lamplit streets were a testament to this simple act of humanity, that even amidst the chaos, there could still be a place for compassion. The civilians walked tentatively into the light, their eyes wide with disbelief, unsure whether to trust this sudden burst of warmth. For so long, they had learned to expect only the worst from the world around them, only the violence and the sorrow. Could this, finally, be a sign that things could change? As the city slowly emerged from the shelter of shadows, there was a sense that something had been shifted, something deep and profound. These lamps were more than mere fixtures in the night. They represented a flicker of care in a world that had grown numb. The British were not there to conquer. They were not there to occupy. They were not there to claim victory. They were simply offering light in a time of darkness, hope in a time of hopelessness. In those lamps, the civilians saw more than just the illumination of their streets. They saw the light of something far more important: the recognition that they mattered, that their suffering had not gone unnoticed. In the days that followed, the presence of the lamps only grew. Each new installation was like a piece of a puzzle coming together, completing the picture of the city's survival. What had once been a battleground of despair now held traces of something else: the possibility of life. The civilians, once resigned to the shadows, slowly began to venture out more often. They would walk beneath the gentle glow of the lamps, hesitant at first, but gradually growing more confident, as if the light itself was coaxing them back into the world they had once known. The simple act of walking through the streets, once a perilous gamble, now became a subtle act of resistance against the darkness that had claimed their city for so long. They were still here, they were still alive, and they were still fighting, not with weapons, but with the power of their collective will to survive. But the lamps were not just a symbolic gesture. They had practical implications as well. Where there had once been the threat of bombers overhead and the terrifying uncertainty of whether the next raid would claim another life, there was now the steady assurance that someone cared enough to light the way. With each passing night, the glow of the British lamps seemed to offer a beacon of hope. For the first time in ages, the civilians could feel the comforting presence of safety, if only for a few hours each night. The lamps, which had begun as a humble attempt to bring light into the darkness, had become something more powerful than anyone could have imagined. A promise that they were not alone, that the world outside was still capable of kindness, and that they would not be forgotten. As the glow of the lamps spread, so did a new sense of purpose among the people. The quiet stillness that had once followed every bombing now seemed less oppressive. The civilians, inspired by the light that surrounded them, began to reclaim small parts of their city. Where once there had been silence and resignation, there now emerged whispers of defiance. It was not a loud rebellion, not an act of violence or protest, but a quiet declaration that life could still go on. People began to repair what they could, to rebuild, to move forward in whatever small way they could. The streets, once devoid of life, were slowly coming back to life. Children, once too frightened to play, began to gather in the light of the lamps, their laughter returning to the air. Parents, who had long abandoned any hope of a normal life, began to look after one another again, to find comfort in shared struggle and in shared humanity. This simple illumination had done what weeks of bombings and sieges could not. It had restored something fundamental in the people of the city. It had restored their belief in connection, in care, in the possibility of something more than mere survival. For so long, the civilians had been left to fend for themselves, abandoned to the chaos and violence of a war they had not chosen. But now, in the glow of the British lamps, they were reminded that they were part of something larger. The lamps, though small and simple, represented a promise of something beyond the war, beyond the destruction. They represented the possibility of peace, of safety, of hope. And so, night after night, as the city slowly began to breathe once more, the British lamps burned brightly, their soft light guiding the way for those who had lived in the shadows for so long. For the first time, the civilians could look up and see something that wasn't just a symbol of destruction or death. It was a symbol of something else entirely, a symbol of the possibility of a future beyond the war, of a city that could be rebuilt, piece by piece, under the protection of light, warmth, and the knowledge that they were not forgotten. In that quiet, steady glow, the people of the city found not just the light of the lamps, but the light of something far more precious, the light of humanity, of kindness, and of survival against all odds. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, they believed that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As the days passed and the lamps continued to burn through the nights, the city, once a place of desolation and fear, began to transform. It was not a dramatic change. There were no grand gestures, no sudden miracles, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible shift. The people who had once shuffled in fear, huddled in their shelters, eyes wide with anticipation of the next bombing, now walked the streets with a renewed sense of purpose. The lamps, soft and steady, had become symbols of something that felt like an impossible dream just months before: hope. In the glow of those lamps, the civilians found a quiet reprieve from the constant anxiety, a brief moment where they could almost forget the war raging outside their doors. The streets, which had once been deserted except for the occasional solitary figure seeking shelter, now held signs of life. Families ventured out in the evenings to gather beneath the warm, amber light, talking in low voices, sharing stories of what life had been like before the war. Children, who had learned to fear the night and its inevitable bombings, now ventured out into the dim glow of the lamps, their laughter a stark contrast to the quiet that had once permeated the streets. It was not that the war had ended, it hadn't, but there was a sense, however fleeting, that they could live for a moment without the constant weight of dread hanging over their heads. For the first time, people dared to dream about what life might be like when the war was over. It was an unusual, almost impossible luxury: hope. Yet, despite this fragile sense of optimism, the reality of their situation was never far behind. The bombs still fell, the air still trembled with the sound of distant explosions, and the city was still scarred by the violence that had shaped its recent history. But the people had learned something invaluable in the past months. They had learned to live with the war. Not to accept it or embrace it, but to endure it, to navigate its constant presence with a quiet strength that they had not known they possessed. The lamps were not an end to their suffering. They were simply a brief interlude, a gentle reminder that survival was still possible. There were nights when the glow from the lamps seemed to grow even more significant. During these moments, when the city was bathed in the warm light, the air felt a little less heavy, the ground beneath their feet a little less unstable. People gathered in small groups under the lamps, talking in hushed tones, not about the war itself, but about what they would do when it ended. What kind of life would they build for themselves? What dreams would they chase once the constant threat of bombs and destruction was behind them? These questions, once unthinkable in the shadow of devastation, began to surface with a quiet urgency. They were not just thinking about surviving, they were thinking about living. It was in these quiet moments, beneath the glow of the lamps, that the city began to reclaim something that had been stolen from it, the ability to envision a future. The present, with its ceaseless bombardments and the constant struggle to stay alive, had consumed them for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to look beyond the next raid. But now, under the steady warmth of the lamps, the civilians began to talk about rebuilding. They spoke of things they would do once the war was over, repainting their homes, reopening their shops, walking through the streets without fear. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. The lamps didn't just illuminate the city, they illuminated the possibility of a future. This new sense of possibility didn't come without its challenges. Beneath the surface of the renewed hope, there was still a deep current of fear and uncertainty. The threat of the next bombing was always present, just as the scars of the past lingered on the broken streets. The city had been irreparably changed, and so had the people who lived there. The war had taken much from them, not just homes, but loved ones, livelihoods, and a sense of safety. They had seen their world shattered, and though the lamps offered a brief reprieve, they could not undo the destruction that had been wrought.